You know, uh, usually when we look back at a historical tragedy, there's this ingrained expectation of cinematic chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you picture the sinking of a great ship, and your mental projection immediately goes to the Hollywood version, you know? People
Yes.
screaming and running wildly across the slanting decks.
Right, the deafening alarms ringing into the night and just sheer unadulterated panic.
Exactly. It's dramatic, and it's loud. And it's exactly what we've been conditioned to expect.
Well, it's the narrative that makes intuitive sense to us, right?
Yeah.
We expect the human reaction to perfectly match the sheer overwhelming scale of the disaster. Like if the ship is dying violently, the people must be reacting violently.
Right. But then you actually step past the movie scripts and into the primary source accounts, the accounts written by the people who are actually standing right there on the deck of the Titanic.
And suddenly that movie projector just breaks down.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at a historical landscape that is honestly hauntingly quiet. The reality of that night was incredibly orderly, incredibly polite, and filled with this bizarre, almost suffocating sense of normalcy.
Yeah. The normalcy is what really gets you.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to strip away all those decades of pop culture lore surrounding the greatest maritime disaster in history. We're going straight to a primary source for this deep dive.
A phenomenal, deeply analytical book
Yeah, it's called The Loss of the SS Titanic.
written by Lawrence Beesley. He penned his account just mere weeks after surviving the 1912 tragedy.
Exactly. And the reason we are using Beasley as our guide today is that he wasn't a sailor, and he wasn't a shipbuilder either. He was just a passenger in a standard two-berth cabin on D-deck.
But what makes his account so gripping is how he processed what he saw.
Yes, we aren't just going to look at what happened to the ship. We're going to analyze the factual, the human, and the systemic realities of that night. We're going to figure out exactly why people behaved the way they did.
And unpack the crucial engineering and psychological lessons that were bought at such a terrible price.
What's fascinating here is the highly specific lens Beasley brings to this event. Because he was a science teacher, right?
All right, a Cambridge-educated man who brought a naturally analytical and critical eye to the disaster. He was decidedly not prone to hyperbole or the sensationalism that gripped the media at the time.
Which is so rare for survivor accounts from that era.
It really is. He didn't just record the horror of the event. He recorded the physics of the ship's movement, the psychology of the crowd dynamics, the precise atmospheric conditions of the night, and the exact step-by-step mechanical failures that led to the sinking.
So when you read his account, you aren't just getting an emotional diary entry.
No, not at all. You are getting a forensic, real-time breakdown of a total systemic collapse.
So as we step into this, I want you, the listener, to try to do something really difficult. I want you to erase your foreknowledge.
Which is hard to do.
Very hard. Because you know how this story ends. You know the ship goes down. But to truly understand the psychology of the people on board, you have to try to stand on the deck with them.
Experiencing this unfolding, very quiet mystery in real time.
Exactly. Completely unaware that the ship is mathematically doomed. Because to understand their choices, you have to forget what you know.
It's really the only way to grasp the illusion of invincibility that surrounded them.
Let's start exactly there. The ship itself. The Titanic was a giant, and the sheer scale of it is hard to wrap your head around even today.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, she displaced 60,000 tons of water. She was powered by engines generating 46,000 horsepower.
Which is staggering for 1912. But unlike her fierce rivals, like the Cunard Line's Mauritania, which was built for pure record-breaking speed, the Titanic was designed for staggering luxury and massive cargo capacity.
Right, she was quite literally a floating palace. She featured 15 transverse, watertight bulkheads that divided the lower hull into 16 compartments.
And famously, she carried 16 lifeboats.
Which were mounted on these new state-of-the-art pieces of equipment called Welland double-acting davits.
And we really need to pause on those Welland davits because it's a crucial, often misunderstood detail of the engineering.
Break that down for us. What is a davit exactly?
So a davit is essentially the crane mechanism used to swing a lifeboat out over the side of the ship and lower it down. The designer, Axel Welland, created a double-acting quadrant system.
Double-acting meaning what in practical terms?
It means that the arms of the crane could swing both inward toward the deck and outward toward the sea. They were specifically engineered to handle 2 or even 3 rows of lifeboats nested inside each other.
Wait, really? So the cranes themselves were already built to hold multiple boats?
Exactly. The Titanic was equipped with 16 of these davit stations. If they had been fully utilized as designed, they were capable of holding up to 48 lifeboats in total.
Oh, wow. 48.
Yes. That would have provided more than enough seating capacity for every single soul on board, passengers and crew combined. The engineering infrastructure was already perfectly in place to support a total evacuation.
That is just sickening to think about. So if the cranes could hold 48 boats, why on earth do they only sail with 16 regular boats and 4 fold-up collapsibles?
Because the decision not to utilize that capacity wasn't an engineering constraint, it was purely an aesthetic and commercial choice.
An aesthetic choice. Are you kidding?
I wish I was. The White Star Line executives felt that having rows and rows of lifeboats cluttered up the first-class boat deck. That deck space was highly prioritized for passenger promenades.
Right, so they wanted wide, sweeping, uninterrupted views of the ocean for their wealthiest clients to stroll past.
Exactly. They legally complied with the painfully outdated British Board of Trade regulations, which we will definitely get into later, and decided that the ship itself was its own ultimate lifeboat.
It's a chilling optimization for luxury over survival.
It truly is.
But to really grasp the sheer, almost uncontrollable physical power of this massive machine they had built, Beesley gives us this incredible story from before they even hit the open ocean.
Right, the incident at Southampton.
Yeah, it's the day of departure from Southampton. The Titanic is moving majestically, very slowly down the dock. People are cheering and waving.
As you do for a maiden voyage.
Exactly. And then, as the Titanic's massive bow comes level with another steamer called the New York, which is tied up tightly to the dock nearby, Beesley hears this sound.
Like a gunshot, right?
Yeah. Bang. Series of sharp, violent reports that sound exactly like a revolver firing into the air.
And those were the thick steel mooring ropes of the New York Reef, literally snapping under an immense invisible tension.
Yes. The thick ropes snap. They fling high into the air and fall right down into the retreating, terrified crowd on the quay. And then the New York begins to move.
Just drifting.
No, it starts creeping toward the side of the Titanic. Slow, stealthily, but with unstoppable force, drawn by this invisible magnetic pull.
And Beesley uses this brilliant analogy to explain what he was watching.
He does. He says it reminded him of being back in his physics lab at Cambridge, where a floating magnet draws smaller steel objects toward it across a table.
Or even simpler, being at his little boy's bath time, where a massive celluloid duck pushes through the water and draws all the smaller floating toys toward it by capillary attraction.
Yeah, the Titanic was so unthinkably huge, her displacement was literally sucking the water and the multi-ton ships sitting in that water right into her side.
It is a masterclass in the physics of fluid dynamics, specifically displacement and suction.
Because of the water she's moving, right?
Right. Consider the volume of water the Titanic is occupying. When a vessel of that staggering size moves forward, even at a crawling pace, it is pushing thousands of tons of water out of its way at the bow.
Making a hole in the ocean, essentially.
Exactly. But more importantly, at the stern, it is creating a massive void. The surrounding water rushes violently in to fill that void. That creates a powerful, localized current, dragging anything floating nearby right along with it.
And didn't a tugboat try to stop the New York?
Yes. A tugboat called the Vulcan actually tried to haul the New York back. It threw a line on her and was snorting and straining with its engines at full reverse, but it made almost no impression against the sheer suction of the Titanic's wake.
Okay, here's where my brain gets stuck. If a ship is so massive that it inadvertently pulls other huge ships into its side just by moving at a creeping harbor pace,
Right.
isn't that a glaring, flashing red warning sign about how impossibly difficult it will be to steer or stop this thing when it's moving at full speed in an emergency?
It absolutely is. It proved to anyone watching that the ship carried an immense, unforgiving momentum. It showed the absolute helplessness of a massive liner to arrest its own inertia.
But they just ignored it.
Well, human nature is fascinating, isn't it? Instead of viewing this incredibly dangerous physical demonstration as a warning about the physics of momentum, the people on board internalized it differently. It planted seeds of superstition, not caution.
Superstition. Like bad omens.
Yes. Sailors historically are a proverbially superstitious group. Beesley notes that right after this near collision, people started whispering.
What were they whispering about?
He mentions a stoker who, while they were stopped in Queenstown, Ireland, climbed all the way up inside the dummy fourth funnel, which was just for ventilation, not smoke, and peered out from the very top looking down at the deck.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, his face was completely black with coal dust. Passengers saw this bizarre, soot-covered face staring down at them from the sky and immediately decided it was a terrible omen.
You're kidding.
Nope. They genuinely feared a supernatural curse on the voyage rather than fearing the simple, unbending mathematical laws of physics they had just witnessed in the harbor.
And that completely insulates them from the real danger. They are worried about omens while sitting inside a machine that is governed entirely by kinetic energy and steel.
Precisely.
And that brings us perfectly to the mindset of the passengers as they head out to sea. They are entirely insulated by unprecedented luxury.
It was basically a floating city.
Yeah. Beesley wanders into the gymnasium on the boat deck, and he paints this almost surreal picture. He sees the gym instructor, Mr. Macaulay, who is this picture of robust, energetic health in crisp white flannels.
And what's he doing?
Macaulay is happily bouncing fully grown adult passengers up and down on these mechanical electric horses and camels.
Electric camel.
Yes, the passengers are laughing, they're socializing, they're riding mechanical camels in the middle of the North Atlantic. They fundamentally believe the ship is its own lifeboat.
The very size and mass that made her inherently dangerous to maneuver made her feel utterly invincible to the people standing inside her.
So this absolute unquestioning faith in the ship's engineering is exactly what created the deadliest element of the entire voyage.
Complacency.
Exactly. The iceberg was the physical cause of the sinking, sure, but the high death toll was caused by a profound, almost unshakable complacency. They were completely and totally insulated from the reality of the ocean just feet below them.
So keeping that deep complacency in mind, let's fast forward to Sunday, April 14th. It's about 11:45 p.m.
The night of the collision.
Right. And the environmental conditions outside the ship are almost supernaturally calm. Beesley talks to an older stoker later on, a man who says that in 26 years of working at sea, he had never, ever seen such a calm night.
Beesley describes the surface of the ocean as looking like a lake of oil.
Yes, a lake of oil. It was perfectly, completely flat, not a single ripple.
And this is where the environment turns lethal. Because to the untrained eye, a perfectly flat, calm sea sounds ideal.
It sounds safe.
Yeah, it sounds like smooth sailing. But it is actually the worst possible condition for spotting an iceberg at night.
Explain why that is.
Well, normally, even in a moderate swell, the dash of the ocean waves against the jagged base of an iceberg surrounds it with a thick circle of white foam.
Right, the breaking water.
Exactly. That phosphorescent breaking water catches the starlight. It is highly visible from a very long distance, long before you can actually see the dark, unreflective mass of the ice itself.
So the water essentially acts as an alarm system.
Yes. The crashing waves highlight the obstacle. But with a sea like a lake of oil, there is no breaking water. There's no white foam at the base.
So it's just invisible.
Basically.
Yeah.
The dilly monster is just sitting there silently, perfectly camouflaged in the pitch blackness.
And to make matters worse, the crow's nest where the two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, are stationed, is extremely high up on the forward mast.
Beesley notes this too, right?
He does. He points out that looking down from that extreme height against a black, star-speckled sea makes a dark, non-reflective iceberg incredibly difficult to spot.
It's a matter of visual contrast, I suppose.
Exactly. Sir Ernest Shackleton, the legendary polar explorer who knew more about navigating ice than almost anyone alive, later testified at the disaster inquiries.
Oh, what did he say?
He explicitly noted that to detect ice in the dark, you want your lookout placed as low down near the waterline as possible.
Wait, really? Why lower?
Yeah.
I would assume higher is always better for visibility, like getting a bird's eye view.
In daylight, yes, higher gives you a farther horizon. But at night, looking for ice, you want to be low so you can look up and see the massive shape of the iceberg silhouetted against the starry sky.
Ah, that makes so much sense.
Right. If you are 50 feet in the air looking down, you are trying to spot a black object against a black ocean. It's nearly impossible until you are practically on top of it.
Wow. So you have this massive, unsteerable ship moving at 21 knots with lookouts stationed too high up on a sea, too calm to provide the necessary phosphorescent warning.
It is a perfect storm of environmental and systemic failures.
So the strike happens. Beesley is down in cabin D56. He's awake, reading a book in his top bunk. And here is where the movie version of this event completely fails us again.
Because there's no explosion.
Right, there is no cinematic crash. He doesn't get violently thrown from his bed. He doesn't hear a deafening crunch of metal.
What does he feel?
He just feels what he thinks is a slight extra heave of the engines and a slightly more rapid rhythmic vibration of his mattress. That's it.
A vibration.
Yeah. And then The engines suddenly stop. I love the analogy he uses here because it is so relatable. He compares the stopping of the massive engines to a loud ticking clock suddenly stopping in a quiet room.
You don't really notice the ticking while you're reading.
But the second it stops, the silence is deafening.
And true to his nature, his scientific mind immediately tries to deduce the mechanical cause of that vibration and the subsequent silence.
Right. He uses logic. He lies there and thinks, we've dropped a propeller blade.
Which makes sense mechanically.
It does. Because he knows that when a ship loses a propeller blade in the water, the engines suddenly have less resistance, so they race away for a brief second, causing an extra shuddering heave before the engineers quickly shut them down to prevent damage.
It's a perfectly logical sound transition. It just happens to be completely fatally wrong.
But I want to pause on the physics of why he only felt a slight vibration.
It's counterintuitive.
Very. If we step back and look at the sheer kinetic energy involved in this collision, it explains exactly why Beesley didn't feel a jolt. The Titanic, weighing 60,000 tons and moving at 21 knots, struck that iceberg with over 1,000,000 foot-tons of impact energy.
1,000,000 foot-tons. I don't even know how to visualize that. What does that mean, practically?
Think of it this way. Imagine the kinetic energy of a fully loaded freight train, easily 100 cars long, hitting a solid brick wall at 100 miles an hour.
Oh my God.
That is the kind of force we are talking about. Now, if the ship's hull had been strong enough to resist that blow, if it had fought back against the ice, the energy would have been transferred backward through the ship.
Meaning the ship would have violently jolted.
Exactly. Beesley would have been thrown from his bunk, people would have been knocked off their feet, and the collision would have been unmistakable.
So the fact that they didn't feel a massive crash
Was the worst possible sign. It meant the steel plates of her hull, which were less than an inch thick, offered zero resistance. They didn't absorb and deflect the energy.
They simply yielded.
They sliced open like wet paper against a razor blade. The smoothness of the impact was the exact signature of its lethality. The ice was cutting deeply into the ship's vital organs, and the ship was just letting it happen.
Wow. The smoothness was the proof of the destruction.
Exactly. And because there was no massive, terrifying jolt, there was no immediate panic among the passengers. This is where we see the ultimate normalcy bias kick in.
Tell us about the smoking room.
Oh man, over in the first-class smoking room, young men are gathered around tables playing cards. As the collision happens, they literally see a 90-foot wall of ice glide past the window.
And what do?
They don't scream. They assume the ship just scraped some fresh paint off her side. One of the card players even jokes about running out onto the deck to grab a piece of the ice to put in his whiskey.
You have to be kidding me.
I'm not. Even the stewards, the people trained to manage the ship, are just leaning unconcernedly against the walls in the corridors chatting.
It's a terrifying portrait of human psychology in a crisis.
It really is.
The human brain is heavily reliant on clear, undeniable sensory input to trigger the fight-or-flight response. Without a loud explosion, a massive crash, or visible fire, the brain defaults to its baseline assumption. Everything is fine.
We just want to believe we're safe.
We actively search for information that confirms our safety and ignore data that contradicts it. The ship is brilliantly lit, the heating is on the card, is still in progress. The external visible environment of the luxury liner completely masks the internal physical reality of the ship bleeding to death below decks.
But physics always wins right. Slowly, the physical reality of thousands of tons of seawater rushing into the bow starts to intrude on this luxury.
When does Beesley notice it?
He notices it for the first time when he leaves his cabin and walks down the stairs. He says there's a curious sense of something being just slightly out of balance. He can't quite put his feet down in the right place on the steps.
Because the deck is pitching.
Right. The stairs are tilting downward, just a fraction of degree toward the bow. The unsinkable ship is slanting. And the quiet, intensely orderly reality of the evacuation has to begin.
And the order is finally given by Captain Smith. Uncover the lifeboat's lifebelts on women and children first.
So it begins.
The crew begins to strip the canvas covers off the boats and swing them out on those well-end davits we talked about earlier. The band starts playing upbeat ragtime music in the lounges to keep spirits up and prevent panic.
Which is so surreal.
But the actual loading of those boats is where the systemic operational failures really begin to compound.
It is genuinely infuriating to read Beesley's account of this. So many of these lifeboats go down into the water half empty. Boat 1 leaves with 12 people in it, designed for 65.
12 people. out of 65.
Yes, and it comes down to a stark, fatal contrast in how the different officers interpreted Captain Smith's verbal orders of women and children only.
How's
Beesley observes this from the deck. He describes how Second Officer Lightoller and Officer Pittman on the port side interpreted the order as a strict exclusionary rule, meaning women and children exclusively.
Oh, I see.
Even if there were empty seats in a lowering boat and no more women in the immediate vicinity, they forcibly prevented men from boarding. Beesley watches newlywed couples being physically torn apart, the husbands forced to stand back on the deck to die, while the officers lower boats with 20 or 30 vacant spots.
It's a tragic breakdown in crisis management, because on the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch interpreted the exact same order as women and children first.
Meaning he prioritized them.
Right, he prioritized women and children, but if they were all loaded and there was still physical room in the boat, he allowed men to get in. This massive discrepancy in interpretation between the port and starboard sides of the ship is a fatal flaw in the chain of command during an emergency.
It resulted in completely unnecessary deaths.
Absolutely.
But the crowd itself, this is what blows my mind. Beesley repeatedly marvels at what he calls their Teutonic obedience.
What does he mean by that?
There are no mobs. There are no riots. People are standing around on the slanting deck almost as if they were waiting for a train or standing in church. There is an innate, almost paralyzing respect for order and class structure.
It's hard to imagine that level of restraint.
And here's where it gets really interesting, and I struggle with this part. I want to put myself in Captain Smith's shoes for a moment. He has been down to the mailroom. He has seen the water. He knows mathematically the ship is doomed.
Right, the designer Thomas Andrews told him.
Exactly. He also knows he only has enough lifeboat seats for about a third of the people standing on his ship. If he announces this clearly over a megaphone, if he shouts the ship is sinking rapidly and 2/3 of you will die because we don't have enough boats, he risks a total violent stampede.
A panic of that magnitude could swamp the boats while they are still hanging on the davits, meaning nobody survives.
Right. So by keeping the severity of the damage quiet, he maintains this eerie order. But in doing so, he dooms hundreds of people who genuinely thought they were safer standing on the warm, brightly lit deck of this massive ship than getting into a dark, tiny wooden rowboat dangling 70 feet above the freezing ocean.
It's a terrible trap.
Was keeping them in the dark the right call?
It is an impossible, almost unsolvable ethical dilemma, and it highlights the ultimate glaring systemic failure of the entire enterprise. Because if there had simply been enough lifeboats, Captain Smith wouldn't have had to make that horrific choice.
He could have just told the truth.
He could have confidently announced the ship is sinking. Please proceed calmly to your assigned lifeboats. There is room for everyone. The primary failure wasn't just the navigational error of hitting the iceberg. The failure was a regulatory and corporate system that forced a captain to weigh the risk of a deadly panic against the absolute certainty of leaving over 1,000 people behind to die.
And even with the order maintained, let's look at the sheer mechanics of actually getting those few boats down to the water. Lowering a fully loaded lifeboat weighing several tons 70 feet down the side of a steel ship is a highly complex, incredibly dangerous physical operation, even in broad daylight, with a fully trained crew.
And these crews were not trained together. This was the maiden voyage.
Right.
Beesley acutely observes that the men assigned to row the boats were mostly cooks, stewards, and bakers. They were hospitality staff, not seasoned deckhands.
They didn't know what they were doing.
They had absolutely no idea how to row together. Their oars were crossing, clashing, and missing the water entirely.
Let's look closely at Beesley's own narrow escape, because it plays out like a mechanical horror sequence.
How did he get off?
He's standing quietly on the starboard deck near boat 13. A crewman shouts out, "Any more ladies on your deck?" Beesley replies, "No." The crewman just looks at him and says, "Then you had better jump."
Wow, just like that.
So Beesley drops into the boat. Right before they begin to lower, a family suddenly rushes up to the rail. The mother is holding a 10-month-old baby. The gap between the ship and the swinging boat is widening, and the baby is literally tossed through the air over the black gap into the arms of a complete stranger in the boat.
Oh my goodness.
Quickly followed by the mother and father jumping in.
And then the terrifying descent begins.
I swear reading this part just builds incredible tension. They're dropping down the side of the ship foot by foot in a series of violent jerks. The brand new stiff ropes are shrieking through the wooden pulleys.
Because they've never been used before.
Right. And as they get close to the water level, looking down into the pitch black, They realize they're trapping directly over the Titanic's massive condenser exhaust.
Ah, the exhaust. Remember, the engineers are still desperately keeping the ship alive. The engines are stopped, but the auxiliary machinery is running.
Doing what?
The ship is pumping out a huge high-pressure stream of water from its internal condensers right above the waterline.
A stream of water so thick and forceful that if it hits their little open boat, it will instantly swamp them and sink them. The crew in Boat 13 starts panicking.
Understandably.
They're feeling around frantically on the floorboards in the pitch black, searching for the release pin. This is the mechanism that frees the ropes from the pulleys so the boat can float away.
But nobody knows where it is because these aren't trained sailors.
Exactly. They hit the ocean, and the sheer force of the exhaust stream immediately hits the boat and washes them violently backward, pinning them tightly against the steel side of the Titanic. The ropes are jammed in the pulleys under the tension. They're stuck fast to a sinking ship.
Yeah.
And then they look up.
Boat 15 is coming down right on top of them.
It is the ultimate claustrophobic nightmare. Think about it. You've just survived the sinking ship. You're floating in the freezing oily water, and you're physically trapped under a multi-ton wooden lifeboat filled with 60 people that is dropping directly onto your head from B-deck.
That's horrifying.
Beesley and a stoker in the bow of Boat 13 are literally reaching their hands up into the dark, touching the wooden bottom of Boat 15, trying to physically push their own boat out from under the crushing weight.
And the sailors up on the boat deck, 70 feet above them, who are lowering Boat 15, cannot hear their desperate shouts over the deafening roar of the escaping steam and that condenser exhaust.
They are totally deaf to it.
They can't see them in the dark either, so they just keep paying out the ropes. The ceiling is literally coming down on them.
It's terrifying. The weight is about to crush them into the ocean. They are saved at the very last possible second by a stoker in Boat 13 who pulls a heavy knife.
What does he do?
He reaches up and furiously slashes the thick pulley ropes holding them to the Titanic. He's shouting 1-2 as he cuts through the fibers. The ropes snap, the boat swings wildly free and is washed clear by the exhaust stream just as Boat 15 hits the water in the exact precise space they had occupied a fraction of a second before.
That singular moment brilliantly encapsulates the chaotic reality of the evacuation. The engineering of the Welland davits worked perfectly. They lowered the boats.
They did their job.
But the human element, the lack of crew training, the sheer panic of navigating unfamiliar mechanics in the dark, almost caused a horrific secondary tragedy. Technology is only as good as the training of the people operating it.
Having miraculously survived the mechanical danger of the ship's massive side, Boat 13 pushes out into the freezing sea. They pull away from the ship resting on their oars, and they turn back to witness the unimaginable.
But the sinking.
And this brings us to a part of Beesley's account that is incredibly striking: the visual and auditory reality of the sinking itself.
What did it look like from out there?
The environmental conditions Beesley notes are bizarrely, almost mockingly serene. There's absolutely no wind. The bitter cold is completely motionless, but the sky above them, he spent a lot of time describing the sky.
The stars, right?
The stars aren't just shining. They are staccato flashing. They are clustered so thickly and brightly that Beesley says it looked like the stars themselves were alive, flashing frantic messages to each other about the calamity unfolding below.
The atmospheric clarity of that specific night was so extreme that it created severe optical illusions.
Really? Like what?
Well, the stars didn't fade or blur at the horizon line like they normally do. When the crisp water line covered a star as the Earth rotated, the water literally seemed to cut the star in half, and it kept sparkling right on the edge.
Wow.
This optical clarity is crucial to the broader story because it actually deceived the captains and lookouts of nearby ships. They later testified that they mistook these incredibly bright, low-hanging stars for the mast headlights of other ships.
So it completely distorted their depth perception and situational awareness.
Exactly.
Against this incredibly beautiful, sparkling backdrop, you have the creeping visual horror of the Titanic sinking. Beesley describes it in a way that is so perfectly analytical. He says the human brain inherently understands basic geometry. We know that the sea level is a perfectly horizontal line. And we know that the rows of bright porthole lights running along the side of a massive ship should be parallel to that sea level.
Two parallel lines.
They should never, ever meet. But as they sat in the rowboat and watched away, they saw those two parallel lines begin to intersect. The brilliant rows of light were plunging into the black water at an awful worsening angle.
And what's striking is that she was completely still while doing it. There was no rolling to port or starboard, no violent thrashing. She just sank slowly, steadily, and smoothly by the head.
Until the physics failed.
Right. Eventually, the physics of buoyancy failed entirely. The ship pivoted on her center of gravity. She lifted her massive stern, revealing her enormous triple bronze propellers high into the night air, and she stood vertically upright.
Like a massive black column reaching up into the stars.
At that exact moment, the ship's lights, which had shone brilliantly all night thanks to the heroic, doomed efforts of the engineers deep below, blinked out, flashed once more, and died forever.
Leaving them in total darkness. And that is when the sound hits them. Beesley describes a sound that nobody ever wants to hear.
Now, pop culture movies and even some survivor accounts often portray this moment as a massive boiler explosion that blew the ship apart or broke it in half with a bang.
But Beesley refutes that right.
Strongly. This raises an important question about the physical mechanics of a sinking ship of that size. Beesley, with his physics background, strongly and explicitly refutes the idea of a boiler explosion.
Why?
He points out that the engineers had drawn the fires from the boilers much earlier to prevent exactly that. What the survivors heard ringing across the water wasn't a sudden, sharp boom of an explosion. It was a prolonged, staggering roar.
What caused it then?
A grinding groan, a massive rattle, and a smash that lasted for 15 or 20 agonizing seconds.
So if it wasn't the boilers exploding, what was it? How does a ship make a noise that loud?
Gravity.
Gravity.
As the ship stood vertically upright, gravity took absolute control over the internal contents of the ship. The massive triple expansion engines, the enormous boilers, the dynamos, the heavy machinery, thousands upon thousands of tons of metal tore loose from their steel bed plates.
Oh my God.
They plummeted straight down the length of the inside of the hull, smashing through the transverse bulkheads, crushing everything in their path. It was the sound of the internal anatomy of the ship totally destroying itself.
Beesley uses an analogy that makes my stomach drop. He compares it to taking all the heavy furniture in a massive house, the pianos, the iron beds, the oak wardrobes, and throwing them all down a grand staircase at the exact same time.
Smashing the stairs and tearing the house apart from the inside.
After that horrific grinding noise, the ship finally gives up. It slides silently, smoothly beneath the surface of the water. But the silence doesn't last.
No, it doesn't.
Because then comes the sound that Beesley says fundamentally changed every single survivor sitting in those lifeboats forever. The sound of the cries. Hundreds of people suddenly plunged into the freezing water, fighting for their lives in the dark.
It's just devastating.
I want you, the listener, to really imagine the sheer mind-bending cognitive dissonance of this moment. You are sitting in a small, overcrowded wooden rowboat. Your feet are freezing. You have just watched the most luxurious, advanced, seemingly invincible feat of human engineering disappear without a trace, as if it never existed.
The sea around you is perfectly calm like a pond.
The stars above you are breathtakingly beautiful, and juxtaposed against this peaceful, silent, gorgeous night is the agonizing, collective, deafening cry of hundreds of drowning men, women, and children.
And the worst part,
your half-empty lifeboat is actively rowing away from them because the crew is terrified that if they go back to help, the desperate swimmers will swamp your boat and drag you all down too.
it is the ultimate moral injury. Beesley writes so powerfully about this. He says that those cries were not just a physical appeal for a rope or a hand.
What were they?
They were an appeal to the heavens against the utter injustice of their own existence. It was a cry demanding that such conditions, such systemic arrogance, never be allowed to happen again.
It gives you chills.
And the heartbreaking reality of the physics of the North Atlantic is that the water temperature was around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That means the vast majority of those people didn't actually drown.
What happened?
They died of rapid hypothermia. Their bodies simply shut down to protect their core. And so the cries didn't end suddenly. They slowly, agonizingly, one by one, faded and died away.
Leaving the survivors completely alone in the dark. It's an isolation that's hard to fathom. They're sitting in these boats. They have no compasses to navigate by.
They think they have no food or water.
Though they do later discover there were some hardtack biscuits hidden in the lockers, right? They're sitting there shivering uncontrollably, waiting for a rescue that they genuinely believe is still at least 12 hours away. Because the last rumor they heard on the ship was that the Titanic's sister ship, was the only vessel coming for them, and she was hundreds of miles away.
This brings us into the agonizing psychology of the long night in the boats and the eventual dawn of rescue.
Talk about that waiting period.
The psychological toll combined with the freezing temperature is immense. They are scanning the black horizon for any sign of a ship's masthead light. At one point, around 3 a.m., the people in Beasley's boat see a faint glowing arch in the sky to the north.
They immediately think, thank God it's the dawn, the sun is coming up.
But the glow arches fan-wise across the sky, shooting faint streamers of light up into the stars. It's not the sun.
What was it?
It's the aurora borealis, the northern lights.
It's almost cruel. The universe is putting on this beautiful, ethereal light show while they are freezing to death in the dark.
It really is.
The aurora is perfectly mimicking the glow of a rescue ship just over the horizon, raising their hopes and then dashing them. But then finally, just as despair is really setting in, they hear a faint, distant boom.
The stoker in Beasley's boat jumps and shouts, "That was a cannon."
It wasn't cannon, of course. It was the Cunard liner Carpathia firing explosive rockets high into the air as she raced toward their position.
And the story of the Carpathia is a beacon of competence in this tragedy. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia had been awakened by his wireless operator with the Titanic's distress call.
He didn't hesitate.
He immediately turned his ship around, shut off the heating to the passenger cabins to divert every single ounce of steam to the engines, and pushed his ship to speeds she wasn't even structurally designed to reach.
And what he drove through to get to those lifeboats is absolutely staggering. Because when dawn finally breaks, the survivors in the lifeboats look around and are treated to a breathtaking and absolute terrifying sight.
The sea around them is covered in an ice field.
An unbroken solid stretch of thick field ice, 70 miles long and 12 miles wide. And dotted all around them like monuments are towering rugged icebergs up to 200 feet high, catching the morning sun and turning brilliant shades of pink and white.
Beautiful, but deadly.
When they realize what they are looking at, they realize that Captain Rostron had driven the Carpathia at full speed in pitch darkness straight through a literal minefield of deadly ice to reach them.
He took an unbelievable, almost reckless risk, relying entirely on extra lookouts posted all over his ship and pure instinctive seamanship. But his gamble paid off. He got there. He saved them.
And this arrival on the Carpathia is where Beesley takes serious pointed issue with the media narrative that was being actively spun in New York and London while they were still at sea.
The newspapers ashore were printing wild, fabricated stories.
They claimed their rescued passengers were half fainting, half hysterical, bordering on hallucination. They described a wild, ungovernable mob of survivors fighting each other.
Yes, Beesley is so incredibly forceful in refuting this. He dedicates a whole section to setting the record straight. He says it is simply categorically not true.
What was the real atmosphere like?
When they rode up to the side of the Carpathia and climbed the rope ladders, there was absolutely no mass hysteria. The dominant, overwhelming emotion was supreme gratitude. The survivors were quiet, they were deeply resilient, and they were highly rational.
They didn't collapse into madness.
No, they drank hot coffee. They immediately formed committees to gather clothes and money for the destitute steerage passengers who had lost everything. They shared blankets. They organized.
It's a classic case of media projection. The press, sitting safely in offices thousands of miles away, projected the panic and madness they felt a situation of this magnitude warranted, rather than reporting the actual psychological reality of the survivors.
It speaks to a morbid, insatiable hunger in the media to pile horror upon horror simply to sell newspapers. They needed the survivors to be broken to fit the dramatic narrative.
And the tragedy of the wireless communications during this period plays right into this media circus.
Marconi operators.
You have families in New York and London desperate for any scrap of news about their loved ones. But the Carpathia only had one single wireless operator, a young man named Harold Cottam.
Just one guy for the whole ship.
Yes. He had already been working for days. He was handling all the official traffic, sending survivor lists. He was exhausted. Eventually, he literally passed out at his station. He fell asleep.
So the flow of official accurate information stopped cold.
And in that information, vacuum misinformation exploded. Beesley himself was listed as missing, presumed dead for days. He was actually reading his own tragic obituaries in the papers when he finally landed in New York.
It makes you think, how does that 1912 media hunger parallel our modern clickbait culture?
Or completely. Back then, they were inventing stories of officers shooting passengers, of people committing suicide on the deck of bloodthirsty mobs. Anything for a headline.
It perfectly highlights the absolute necessity for accurate, verified information in a crisis. Whenever there is a vacuum of truth, it is immediately filled by sensationalism and fear.
But surviving the wreck and then navigating the chaotic media circus in New York was really only the first part of the ordeal for Beesley. The second, and arguably more important part, was his dedication to analyzing the disaster systemically to ensure it never happened again.
Exactly. And this is where we get into the anatomy of blame and Beasley's brilliant blueprint for reform.
After a disaster like this, it is so easy, so human to just point the finger at one person. To point at Captain Smith and say he drove too fast through an ice field in the dark. He ignored the warnings. He's the villain, case closed.
But Beasley's analysis of indirect versus direct responsibility is incredibly nuanced and thought-provoking.
What does he argue?
He argues that Captain Smith was merely operating under an established systemic custom of the sea. The probability of a modern steel ship hitting an iceberg in a way that would actually sink it was mathematically considered by the industry to be a 1 in a million insurance risk.
A calculated risk.
Right. Captains of fast mail liners routinely drove through fog and ice at high speeds to keep their strict schedules. They had done it hundreds of times over decades and won the gamble every time.
Smith took the exact same calculated gamble that every other captain took, and he just happened to lose.
But Beasley asks the deeper question, why was he taking that gamble in the first place?
Because the public demanded it. This is where Beasley turns the mirror on society. He points out that the traveling public relentlessly demanded speed, luxury, and punctuality.
We complain bitterly if a train is 10 minutes late.
Exactly. We demand to cross the ocean in record time. The White Star Line wasn't operating in a vacuum. They were supplying exactly the speed and luxury the public was demanding and paying for.
And this exposes the massive corporate and legal failures underlying the whole enterprise. Let's look at the British Board of Trade.
They were responsible for maritime safety laws, right?
Yes. Their lifeboat regulations hadn't been updated since 1894.
1894, that's almost 20 years earlier.
Back then, the largest ships were 10,000 tons. The Titanic was 60,000 tons. Yet the law still calculated lifeboat requirements based on a ship's cubic tonnage, not the number of human beings it carried.
So the Titanic legally complied with the law.
She actually carried more boats than the law required, but it was nowhere near enough for the actual number of souls on board. Furthermore, the very architecture of the ship was fatally compromised to accommodate luxury.
Okay, let's dive into the architecture, specifically those watertight bulkheads. The Titanic was famously called practically unsinkable because of these compartments. But as we know, they were flawed. How exactly did they fail?
The flaw was in their height. The Titanic used transverse bulkheads walls that ran horizontally side to side across the ship. But these walls didn't go all the way up to the top deck.
Where did they stop?
They only went up to the saloon deck, or even lower in the middle of the ship. So when the iceberg sliced open the first 5 compartments, the ship started sinking by the bow. The water filled the first compartment, reached the top of the bulkhead wall, and simply spilled over the top into the next compartment, pulling the ship further down.
Like an ice cube tray. If you fill one slot in an ice cube tray too high, the water just crests the divider and fills the next one until the whole tray is flooded.
Exactly. It's called progressive flooding. Now contrast that with older or rival ships.
How were they built?
If she had been built like the older Great Eastern, which featured a honeycomb double hull throughout, or like the Cunard's Mauretania, which had longitudinal bulkheads walls running the length of the ship front to back that went all the way up to the main deck, she likely would have survived the sideswipe.
Why did they build like that?
The flooding would have been contained to the outer edge, but those longitudinal bulkheads take up massive amounts of interior space that the White Star Line wanted to use for sweeping luxury cabins, grand staircases, and massive dining rooms.
They sacrificed structural survivability for architectural grandeur.
They did.
And then there's the technology that could have saved them, which, when you read about it, is absolutely mind-blowing. Beesley dedicates a significant amount of his book to championing a forgotten technology, submarine bells.
This is a critical, tragic point about the limitations of their tech. They had wireless telegraphy, the Marconi system. It was a miracle of its age, but it had severe limitations.
Wait, what?
First, it couldn't tell you the direction a signal was coming from. It just beeped in your headset. Second, the radio waves were subject to atmospheric interference. And third, if a ship's main engines starve, like the Titanic's did, the dynamos eventually fail, the wireless loses power, and the signal dies.
This is very fragile?
Yes. Furthermore, traditional sound in the air, like firing a cannon or blowing a foghorn, is highly unreliable. Sound in the air is distorted by fog, swallowed by wind, and bounces off temperature inversions.
But water. Water is a vastly superior medium for sound. Beesley explains that sound travels through water at roughly 4,400 feet per second with almost no deviation or loss of clarity.
So how does the bell work?
Beasley describes this submarine bell system, which already existed at the time. A ship has two small water-filled iron tanks bolted directly to the inside of its hull, below the waterline, one on the port side, one on the starboard. Inside these tanks are microphones.
It's essentially an early rudimentary form of sonar communication.
Exactly.
If a lightship or another vessel wanted to signal its presence in dense fog, it would lower a physical bell into the ocean and ring it. The sound waves travel for miles through the water, hit the steel hull of the receiving ship, pass through the steel into the water tanks, and hit the microphones.
And how do they know where the sound is coming from?
The officer on the bridge wears a headset. By using a switch to toggle back and forth between the port and starboard microphones, he can listen to which side the bell sounds louder. By turning the ship until the sound is equally loud in both ears, he knows he is pointing exactly at the source of the sound, even in pitch blackness or zero visibility fog.
And here is the absolutely crushing irony of the entire Titanic story. The California, another ship, was sitting stopped in the ice field, less than 20 miles away from the Titanic.
Just sitting there.
Their single wireless operator had gone to sleep for the night. The crew on the deck of the Californian actually saw the Titanic's distress rockets in the distance, but they didn't understand what they meant, and they couldn't wake their radio operator to ask.
It's agonizing.
If the Titanic had been equipped with a simple $300 submarine bell, they could have lowered it into the water and rung it continuously. And if the Californian had been equipped with those basic receiving microphones, their officers would have heard that ringing loud and clear right through the hull of their ship.
They could have pinpointed the Titanic's exact location.
They could have navigated directly to them in the dark, saving everyone, without ever needing the wireless radio at all.
It's a tragic, multi-layered technological oversight, and it brings Beasley to a profound conclusion about systemic safety.
What does he conclude?
He argues forcefully that relying on the moral responsibility of corporations is too weak an incentive when weighed against the intense pressures of commercial competition.
Profit over people.
Exactly. The directors of the White Star Line weren't evil cartoon villains twirling their mustaches trying to kill people. They were just dangerously indifferent. They were blinded by their own technological hubris and the drive for profit.
So what does this all mean for us? Beasley's conclusion is that safety is only ever prioritized when the law absolutely forces it.
It has to be mandated.
You cannot rely on a massive corporation to voluntarily reduce its profitable cargo space or its luxury cabins to add rows of lifeboats or expensive longitudinal bulkheads if their competitors aren't legally forced to do the exact same thing.
Right. The open sea cannot be a lawless zone where safety is treated as a luxury add-on.
Precisely. And his arguments were validated. The loss of the Titanic was the immediate catalyst for sweeping fundamental international maritime laws.
The International Ice Patrol was formed to track icebergs, and it still operates today.
Lifeboat requirements were drastically overhauled, not based on tonnage, but mandating a physical seat for every single soul aboard.
And 24-hour wireless watches became strictly mandatory for all passenger ships. It took a tragedy of unimaginable, horrifying proportions to violently awaken the world from its lethargic, profit-driven selfishness.
It's an incredibly heavy journey we've been on today. We started by watching the massive magnetic suction of the Titanic leaving port, literally pulling the New York toward her.
The warnings that were ignored.
We felt the eerily quiet, vibration-like collision in the dark that doomed her. We watched the orderly but deeply flawed and tragic evacuation, the terrifying mechanical roar of the engines tearing loose as gravity took hold, and the stunning realization that an entirely preventable tragedy was born from deep systemic complacency.
And yet, through all of that analytical breakdown, Beasley reminds us of what true human heroism actually looks like in the face of disaster.
It wasn't the loud cinematic posturing, the gun waving, or the dramatic speeches we see in the movies.
True heroism was the quiet, uncelebrated duty of the engineers remaining deep down in the freezing, flooding bowels of the ship, keeping the dynamos running and the lights burning until the absolute final plunge so that others on the deck could see to escape.
It was the intuitive, unspoken camaraderie of a group of freezing strangers balancing precariously in the pitch dark on an overturned, collapsible boat, quietly reciting the Lord's Prayer together to keep their spirits alive.
That quiet resilience, that commitment to duty, is the true, enduring human legacy of the disaster.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you to ponder. We look back at the people of 1912, and it's easy to marvel at their naivety. We judge their blind, absolute faith in the unsinkable ship.
We think, how could they be so arrogant? How could they ignore the ice warnings?
But I want you to look around at our world today. Look at our total reliance on incredibly complex systems. Think about the 2008 financial crisis, where financial institutions were considered too big to fail, packed with toxic assets hidden behind complex algorithms until the bulkheads broke and it spilled over, taking the global economy down with it.
The progressive flooding of our modern systems.
Exactly. Think about our reliance on interconnected global energy grids, or AI algorithms that we barely understand, but that now run our logistics, our markets, and our lives. We inherently assume our modern systems are simply too big, too complex, and too advanced to fail.
Just like they did.
So I ask you, what is the unsinkable Titanic of our current era? And when the ice finally appears in the dark, will we have built enough lifeboats, or will we just keep playing cards in the smoking room waiting for the ticking clock to stop?
A vital question, and one we need to answer before the engines stop.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.